Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's webinar on the New York Travel Advisory Guidelines. My name is Kathy Purdy. I am a marketing manager at Bond. Two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and our presenters will do their best to address those throughout the webinar. Once the webinar has concluded, please take a moment to complete the brief survey, as our attorneys do read your comments and suggestions. So we would appreciate you doing that. So to get things started, I'm going to hand it over to Krista Cook in our Syracuse office.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. I thank you for joining Adam and I today. We are going to try to give all of you a summary of the new New York State Travel Advisory rules. And certainly we are, this new travel advisory rules went into effect just this week. And there's certainly some practical concerns about the rules and a few unanswered questions. But this morning we're going to walk you through the basics of the rule so you understand the executive order and the new guidelines. And, before we get started, I would mention that we do have a lot of information on our website as well. So if there's any unanswered questions or you would like some additional information, check out our website. We have the information about the new rules there, or contact your bond attorney to walk through some of these issues. So I want to start with kind of where we've been to give us a baseline of, how we got, here this week. The governor had issued, as we all know, Executive Order 205, which required individuals that entering New York State from designated states with significant rates of transmission of COVID-19 to quarantine for a mandatory 14-day period. So we've been living with that rule of the 14-day quarantine for several months now, since the end of June. We know that that rule of the 14-day quarantine applied only if the traveler spent at least 24 hours in the designated state in the other state. And under the old rules, there were exemptions for first responders and essential workers. Shortly after issuing the Executive Order 205, the governor issued a second executive order that extended those rules to international travelers from level 2 or 3 countries. And interestingly, under the old rules, the quarantine applied even if there was a negative COVID-19 test. So individuals who went and got tested during the 14-day period under the old rules could not exit the mandatory quarantine. And as many of you know who have been following our webinars and the governor's press releases throughout those several months, it was a little bit difficult. It became even more difficult to update that list of restricted states. And as of the end of October, 39 plus states were on that list. So this approach became difficult, and really the governor announced it was really no longer feasible with so many states on the list. And just the practicality of enforcing that 14-day quarantine. So effective this week on Wednesday, the new travel guidelines that were announced will allow out-of-state travelers to test out of the mandatory 14-day quarantine. So we're going to walk you through how that applies. Kathy, if you could just go to the next slide. And just to be clear, we've gotten some questions about, how, just the baseline of how this works. So I want to make clear that this applies to all states, to travel to every state, regardless of the COVID levels in that state, as well as any country with a CDC level or 2 or 3, okay? So in the executive order is 205.2. You can find it on the governor's website. The other thing we want to update you about is on November 3rd, the Department of Health issued new interim guidelines applicable to this new executive order. So that gives us a little more guidance about how to interpret these new travel advisory rules. The November 3rd guidance can be found on the Department of Health website. It's a little bit difficult, tricky to find, but it is there. It had been up and down a few times, but you can find it now on the Department of Health website. So as I suggested, the new guidelines eliminate the list of restricted states. So we will no longer have a list of what states are designated to apply to the guidelines. There's now a uniform rule across the country. One of the exceptions to keep in mind is that travelers from that are going into and out of contiguous states will not be subject to these new travel advisory guidelines, regardless of whether those states have significant levels of community spread for COVID. So individuals may travel freely between New York and the 5 contiguous states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. The idea behind that is that the travel between those states, the bordering states, really was so frequent, and a lot of that travel was necessary for work for individuals who live on the borders of those states and travel back and forth on a daily basis. Kathy, if you go to the next slide. So here's a summary of the basic rule. All travelers entering New York from a non-bordering state, so not one of those contiguous states we just talked about, have to quarantine for 14 days. That's the basic rule. So the mandatory 14-day quarantine still is applicable, unless the individual meets the test out procedure. So here's what the test out procedure says. The individual has to obtain a test within 72 hours of departure from that other state. So prior to coming back to New York, the individual is going to get a test in that other state. The test is again obtained not in New York, but in the other state in which the person traveled to. And the test can be obtained anytime in the 72 hours before the individual comes back to New York. So they could get it 2 days before they anticipate coming back to New York, a day before. They could get it even the day that they're going to leave to come back to New York. The executive order and the guidance do not anticipate that the individual is going to have the results of that test prior to coming back to New York. They're simply going to get the test in that other state. So they're going to get the test in the other state, and then they're going to, when they arrive in New York, they're going to quarantine for 3 days. Based on the time that they arrive in New York. So there's a mandatory 3-day quarantine. And then on day 4 of the quarantine, that individual is going to obtain a second COVID test, and that test will be in New York. If the test is positive, obviously they will need to remain in quarantine and subject to the Department of Health rules and guidelines. But if both tests come back negative, the individual can then exit that quarantine. The caveat is that they have to have received the receipt of the second negative diagnostic test. So on day 4 of arrival in New York, they're going to get the test in New York. That second test, they have to wait till they get to the results of that test in order to ensure that both of those tests were negative. Okay, I'm sorry. Kathy, if you could just switch to the next slide. So those rules that I just went over assume that the individual has traveled outside of New York State for 24 hours or more, right? However, if an individual takes a short trip, right, of less than 24 hours, they take a day trip outside of New York, there are different rules. The individual does not need to get a COVID-19 test in that other state and doesn't need to quarantine. So the 3-day quarantine doesn't apply. But upon returning to New York, on day 4 of being in New York, they're going to get a COVID test in New York. If it's negative, they are all set. If it's positive, they will be subject to the Department of Health guidelines and isolation orders. Okay, next slide, Kathy. So just some issues that we have been getting questions on. The executive order and the new guidance confirm that local health departments will be working with individuals to validate the test if necessary. And if the test comes back positive, that will allow them to issue isolation orders, initiate contact tracing. If individuals choose not to get the testing, if they choose not to take advantage of this test out procedure, they are subject to the mandatory 14-day quarantine. So they were required to stay in quarantine for the full 14-day period. The new executive order also continues to contain some limited exceptions for medical procedures that can't be postponed. So the individual can, when they are back in New York, attend those medical procedures and then go back into quarantine. We have received a lot of questions about essential workers, and they continue to be exempt as they were under the previous executive order. They're exempt from these travel advisory rules. The new November 3rd guidance gives us a little more information about the essential workers and the rules that will apply to them. One of the things that we would note that's contained in that November 3rd guidance is interesting about teachers, childcare workers, school employees. They will need to quarantine for the 3-day period after returning to New York from a non-bordering state if they've been there for longer than 24 hours, and they must be tested on day 4 after arriving in New York. And the guidance indicates that the reason for this rule, sort of exception for teachers and childcare workers, is due to the environment in which they're working. So there's a sensitivity to the context in which those individuals are entering. So they are not completely exempt as essential workers. They are, under the new guidance, subject to that 3-day quarantine and testing on day 4. If you could just go to the next slide. One of the other things that the executive order and the guidance makes clear is that all individuals who are traveling, assuming that it's from a non-contiguous state, are required to complete the traveler health form. That traveler health form will be submitted at the airport if they're traveling by plane. If individuals are traveling by train or car, they will need to fill out the form online. And the traveler health form continues to be on the governor's page and the Department of Health website. One of the other things that we have gotten questions about, in light of obviously the upcoming holidays, and New York employers are aware that many employees will be traveling potentially for the holidays, is how do these new travel advisory guidelines impact my decision or ability to grant or deny vacation requests in light of these new rules. And we'd urge you to look at your applicable vacation policies, CBAs, but most of those policies grant employers some discretion. And so employers will have to keep in mind that although these new travel advisory guidelines provide individuals the opportunity to significantly shorten the time that they're going to be quarantined and thus out of work following their vacation, that's not guaranteed because you don't know for sure whether the testing will come back negative. And there is still obviously some period of quarantine. So on top of the vacation, it will be at least a 4 to 5 day mandatory quarantine, even under the new rules. So that's something that employers are going to want to think about with the upcoming holidays. And the last thing I wanted to mention before I turn it over to Adam is that the new executive order continues to warn individuals that this is about a sense of personal responsibility to the individual. That as New Yorkers, as travelers, we're expected to abide by the executive order and the quarantine rules, and individuals who do not are subject to a penalty of up to $10,000. And we've had some employers ask us about that and their obligations. That penalty under the executive order applies to the individual, not to the employer. But we have warned and will continue to urge New York employers to be aware of what their employees are doing as far as travel, because we think there could potentially be some consequence to employers who don't make a good faith effort to ensure their employees are following these orders. So that's all I have as far as this summary, and my colleague Adam is going to address some more practical problems and unanswered questions. So take it away, Adam.
Krista, thanks so much, and thank you to everyone who's with us on this beautiful Friday morning. Many of you probably attended our Tuesday webinar that we do every Tuesday, where we cover a wide range of coronavirus topics. This Tuesday, we did a little blurb on the updates to the travel advisory, and we got over 80 questions. So I went through those questions and summarized them by category. And I'm going to try to hit on the questions that we saw the most. I mean, we have in the last 15 minutes already 57 questions, which I hope to be able to answer most of during the next 15 minutes. So let's start with international travel. How, if at all, have the rules regarding international travel changed? And Krista did a very nice job of giving you a little historical context about the travel quarantine. I'm going to address the historical context of the international travel restrictions specifically. So if you recall, when the first guidance came out in June, the first travel guidance came out in June, international countries were not covered. They weren't discussed. At that point, the CDC still had a 2-week quarantine requirement for travel from level 2 or level 3 countries. So New York State's guidance didn't cover it. On October 8th, the state put out revised travel guidance, which made it clear that international travelers had to quarantine for 14 days, no essential worker exception, no exceptions. 14-day quarantine was required for international travel. The state, with this most recent guidance, has changed that again. So now we know a couple of things about international travel according to the most recent November 3rd guidance. First of all, everyone traveling from an international country that is level 2 or level 3 can test out. So this test out procedure that Krista just went over applies to international travelers. In addition, we know that international travelers must complete the travel health form. This is another thing that was cleared up in the November 3rd guidance. In addition, we also know that international travelers can use the essential worker exemption. If you recall in the October 8th guidance, That document specifically said international travelers could not use the essential worker exception, but now we know they can, so it's back. And for a lot of clients who have international business, this was very good news. The state on its website also has a list of, I think it's 31 countries now that don't require a quarantine. So these are countries that don't fit within the level 2 or level 3 requirement, or level 2 or level 3 designation by the CDC. So you can check on the state's travel website to see which countries don't have the quarantine requirement. So there's actually many countries in the Caribbean. So that's good news if anybody is planning on taking a vacation. All right, so those are the changes to international travel. Next question, can rapid COVID tests be used to test out a quarantine? And I think the underlying question here is, does the guidance require a particular test? And I saw this question already in the questions this morning. So the answer is the guidance does not specify anything other than a diagnostic test. So it doesn't say whether it has to be a PCR test or a rapid test. It says diagnostic test. Based on that, I think that any approved test is going to work. So if an employee gets a rapid test, I think that's fine. But again, there's no clear guidance. That's just our interpretation. Next question. What is the travel question you should be asking on the daily screening questionnaire? So this has changed as well. Many of you in your daily screening questionnaires for employees are asking, prior to November 4th, the question was, have you traveled to any of these states? And it was the list of states that were on the state's travel list. That should change now. The question should just be, and I want to read this to get it right, in the past 14 days, have you traveled internationally or to any state or territory other than Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Vermont? So that should be the question, and the answer to that question should prompt contact with human resources about what to do next. So the question should be modified in that way. The next frequently asked question that we got, have the rules for essential workers changed? And the answer is a little bit. So we know that under the prior travel guidance, essential workers were exempted from the quarantine requirement so long as they did a couple of things. One, they had to get a test within 24 hours. 2, they had to monitor their symptoms, temperature, etc. And 3, they had to limit their public activity for 14 days. So that was the old rule. The new travel guidance document that we got late on November 3rd, early November 4th, modified the requirement for individuals who are essential workers who are going to be in New York for a long term. So if you remember, the essential worker exemption was broken out into short-term stay, medium-term, long-term. The long-term guidance applies to anyone who lives in New York because you're going to be in New York when you come back for more than 36 hours. So that's really the most relevant portion of the essential worker guidance, because if you have an employee who lives in New York, goes to travel, and then comes back, the long-term essential worker guidance is going to apply. So here is what the new guidance says about employees, essential employees, I should say, who travel on vacation and come back for more than 24 hours. They have to get a test on day 4, as Krista said. So this is a change. Before, essential employees had to get tested within 24 hours of their return. The state has changed that. That prompts the question, and I saw it in the Q&A already, well, do essential employees have to quarantine while they're waiting to get that test on day 4? The guidance isn't clear, but I think the answer is no. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a reason to have an essential worker exemption. In addition, the paper form of the traveler health questionnaire, so that traveler health form that has to be filled out, the paper form of that says, quote, essential workers from other states and countries are not required to quarantine. So that's further support for our conclusion that if you're an essential worker, you don't have to quarantine during those 3 days before you get the test when you come back. Another difference is that essential workers, it's very clear now, have to fill out the traveler health form. It doesn't matter if you're an essential worker, you have to fill out the traveler health form, unless you travel to a contiguous state. And finally, the difference, I think, another difference for essential workers is that if they're in a non-contiguous state for less than 24 hours, just like everybody else who's in a non-contiguous state for less than 24 hours, they have to get tested on day 4. They don't have to quarantine like everybody else, but they do have to get tested on day 4. So those are the changes to the rules regarding essential workers. All right, now this is an interesting. Yep.
Adam, can I just, I want to jump in before you go on to the next question, which is also a very important question, but the essential workers, and I see this question coming up, is individuals I think are a bit confused because all of the new rules that Adam just laid out for you are in the November 3rd guidance.
Right.
It can be a little bit tricky to find, but the content on the website still reflects the old rules.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So that is something. If you go to, and I wish I could share my screen here, but if you go to New York's travel advisory webpage, under the overview section, which is right at the top, at the bottom, there is a highlighted link that says read the detailed travel guidance. That's what you're going to want to click on. I actually put in the chat a link to the guidance already. So if you open up the chat box at the bottom, you're going to find a link to the updated November 3rd guidance. And the November 3rd guidance is going to have everything I'm talking about, including the changes for essential workers. So thank you for pointing that out, Krista. That's a good point. You know, the state is sometimes slow in updating all of their documentation, but we know that this detailed travel guidance that they put out on November 3rd is the controlling document. All right, so the next question, which we've been getting a lot, is are employees entitled to paid leave after traveling to a non-contiguous state for more than 24 hours? And I think to answer this question, you have to look at what COVID leave is available and then figure out whether or not they're entitled to it. So we start with New York State paid COVID leave. It is not going to be available for individuals who travel for non-business purposes, so they travel for vacation or personal reasons, and those employees know that if they travel, they're not going to be entitled to it. So in almost all circumstances, employees who travel to non-contiguous states for non-business reasons are not going to be entitled to New York State paid COVID leave. The second source of available COVID leave is the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act Emergency Paid Sick Leave. And under the prior guidance, it was not clear. There was no definitive guidance from the federal government. There was no definitive guidance from the state. But we know that the first category of FFCRA Emergency Paid Sick Leave was available for individuals who were subject to a governmental order of quarantine. So when somebody returns from travel to a non-contiguous state, they are subject to a quarantine. So our interpretation has been that they may be entitled to that 14 days of COVID leave, emergency paid sick leave. Now, that was before the travel guidance changed. So at this point, we know employees can test out, all employees. Essential employees don't have to stay home or don't have to quarantine, but even non-essential employees can test out of the quarantine requirement by getting a test before they leave the offending state and on day 4 when they are back in New York. So our opinion at this point is that FFCRA leave may be available for those first 4 days, but then if the employee refuses to get tested or fails to get tested, then the FFCRA leave is not going to be available after that 4th day because they are making a choice at that point not to get tested, not to test out. So I hope that answers the question. Again, that's not clear. There is no clear answer to that question. That's just our best interpretation. Kathy, next slide, please. All right. I saw this question quite a bit in the Q&A as well. Can an employee test out if they don't get a test within 72 hours before they arrive in New York? And the answer is no. The guidance is very clear. This test out procedure is an exception to the 14-day quarantine rule requirement. So strict compliance with its requirement, or strict strict compliance is required. So somebody has to follow those 3 steps. They have to get tested within 72 hours of when they leave the offending state. They have to quarantine for 3 days in New York and get tested on the 4th day. They are not entitled to return to work until they have 2 negative tests. So unless there's strict compliance with those requirements, employees cannot return to work under this test out procedure. Next question. Can an employer request copies of the negative test results? Yes. And I think it's a good idea to do so. There's nothing indicating you can't, and you have a legitimate interest in requesting these test results to allow an employee to come back to work. So I think the answer to that is yes. What if I am only in a non-contiguous state for 48 hours? That's a good question as well. The guidance says you have to get, well, first of all, the guidance says that if you are in a non-contiguous state for more than 24 hours, then the 14-day quarantine applies unless you test out. So we know that if you want to come back and test out, you have to get a test within 72 hours of when you leave the offending state. Does that mean that if you're only there for 48 hours, you could technically get tested in New York before you leave? Go to the offending state, not get tested while you're there, come back, quarantine for 3 days, get tested on day 4. And if both tests are negative, you're okay? I think so. I mean, by the letter of the guidance, the first test has to be done within 72 hours before you enter New York from the offending state. But again, that's not clear. Does an employee have to stay in quarantine while awaiting results of the second test? The guidance is pretty clear here. Yes, you can't come out of the quarantine unless you get the second test. Once you have the negative second test, you're able to leave quarantine. Next question. Can an employer implement more stringent requirements than what is prescribed by the travel guidance? And again, the answer is yes. As with any of the safety precautions that are provided by the state, either in their reopening plans or in this travel guidance, if you as an employer want to impose heightened safety restrictions, you are absolutely free to do that. And there's nothing preventing you from doing so. So I see we have 125 questions in the chat box. I hope I answered some of them, but obviously I didn't answer all of them.
Yeah, Adam, if I could just jump in, and one of the questions that I see repeated in our the questions that are being submitted as we're speaking is questions about how do I know if my employees are an essential employee? What is the definition of essential employees? That sure. Definition is also, you can check our website as well as the governor's website and the Department of Health website. To answer one of the specific questions, one of the definitions of an essential employee is an employee who qualifies under the Empire State Development exemptions that we had all kind of gone through at the beginning of this back in the spring. So if you have one of those exemptions that is an essential employer, your employees would qualify for an exemption under this travel advisory, subject to the rules in the new guidance.
Yeah, so the new guidance document, like the other travel guidance documents, has an explicit section saying, here is what an essential worker is, and it defines it. So if you go to the link where I put, that I put in the chat, and you go to page 4, it says, with respect to essential workers, an essential worker is, and then there's 3 categories. And any individual employed by any entity that is included in the Empire State Development Corp's list of essential businesses. 2, an individual who meets the COVID testing criteria pursuant to their status as either an individual employed as a healthcare worker, first responder, or in any person employed in a nursing home, long-term care facility, or other congregate care setting, or an individual who is employed as an essential employee who directly interacts with the public while working. So, and they link to another guidance document. So look at that. That will tell you exactly who is an essential employee for purpose of the travel guidance. Okay, so a lot of people are asking me to reread the question for your daily questionnaire. So I will do that.
And while Adam's looking for that, I just want to address one of the questions I also see coming up a lot is sort of the practicalities. Many of our the questions in the chat are, this all assumes that I'm going to be getting the testing. I'm going to be able to get the testing in a different state, and those results are going to be coming back within a matter of days. It's all going to be done very swiftly. Those are practical issues that will have to be flushed out. Some states have testing available. Some of them are free, some of them are not. And I know that I've heard from clients that it's difficult to get a test, and sometimes the test results do take a period of time to get back. So obviously none of that is, those practical issues aren't addressed in the executive order, the guidance, but as many of you are pointing out, those are issues that you will have to work through.
Okay, so here's the question. In the past 14 days, have you traveled internationally or to any state or territory other than Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Vermont? So that's the question. And I've seen a lot of questions about whether or not we're going to post this. I believe we do for all of our webinars. And there are quite a few more questions here. I would say this: if you have questions, please contact your preferred bond attorney. They can get the answer for you. If you want to contact me or Krista, feel free to do that as well. I hope that we answered a lot of these questions. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I hope this webinar provided some clarity for you all in this confusing time with guidance that keeps changing. So we are going to stay on top of everything. If there's any updates, we will obviously let everyone know. And we thank everyone for being here today.